Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Karim Ziani, and I'm an associate within Folio Hag LLP law firm within the International Arbitration and Litigation Department. I'm also the Deputy Secretary General of the African Society of International Law. And today I'm here as part of the Global Engagement Series organized by the American Society of International Law, also known as ASIL. Together with and in partnership with its sister organizations, ASIL is organizing its fourth annual Global Engagement Series, and this year's topic, as had been said, is about international law in an interdependent world. Joining us today for the Africa Global Engagement Series event, we have Ambassador Dr. Namira Negm, who will be discussing her recent publication titled An Introduction to the African Union Environmental Treaties. First, let me introduce Ambassador Negm. She's an Egyptian citizen holding an LLB in law from the University of Ain Shams in Cairo, Egypt. She also has an LLM and a PhD in public international law from the King's College of London in the United Kingdom. She started her career in private practice before moving to foreign affairs and diplomacy. To remind the audience of her exceptional career, she was part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Egypt and served various roles over the course of the two last decades, including Ambassador of Egypt to Rwanda, head of the Anti-Corruption Unit, legal advisor to the Mission of Egypt to the United Nations in New York, legal and political officers in the Embassy of Egypt to the Netherlands. Ambassador Negm also worked for the African Union and is still serving for the African Union. Indeed, she is the first director of the African Migration Observatory and was previously the first female legal counsel in the history of the African Union. While leading the legal counsel's office of the African Union, Ambassador Negm was also the lead counsel of the AU legal team before the International Court of Justice in the Chagos advisory opinion and the International Criminal Court in the Jordan's appeal in the Bashir case. She contributed to the drafting of all legal documents issued by the AU from 2017 to 2022, including the agreement on the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I'm sure that everyone else will listen to a lot of developments on this agreement later on. On top of her exceptional professional career, Ambassador Negm also teaches at university. Indeed, she is a visiting professor of international law and international relations at the American University in Cairo, the Geneva Summer School of International Law, and the University of Rwanda. And finally, Ambassador Negm is a member of the editorial board of the International Organization Law Review and a member of the advisory board of the International Institute of the Rule of Law and Justice. Today, discussing with Ambassador Negm, we have Rumbidzai Maweni. Rumbidzai is leading the discussion on the publication of Ambassador Negm. She is a senior associate within Folio Hag's international litigation and arbitration practice, and she specializes in representing sovereign states and state-owned entities before international dispute resolution bodies in investment cases and also commercial cases related to natural resources and environmental remediation. As I'm leaving the floor now to Rumbidzai, I'm just telling the audience that you do have the opportunity to ask questions within the Q&A sections that is at the very bottom of your screen. Thank you everyone for listening today.
Thank you for that introduction, Karim. And thank you for joining us today, Ambassador Negm, to discuss your timely book. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I'd like to start by asking you how the idea for this book came about and who is the intended audience.
Thank you very much for having me today, and good day, everybody. Well, the idea started actually in a discussion between me and Professor Makamba Bing, who's the president of AFSIL, speaking on moving African Union law into a discipline, because we have disciplines like EU law in education, but we don't have a discipline on the African Union law. And as you just mentioned, environment is very topical, and many around the globe don't know that in the history of 65 years of the African Union, and before it, the Organization of African Unity, know that we have this body of law in relation to environment. Honestly, while even working on the book, like we have this myth that the first African Union Treaty or OAU Treaty on protection of the environment is the Natural Resources Convention. But in the course of working on the book, I realized, no, it's actually, we have another convention, which is the Phytosanitary Convention, which was the first adopted after OAU. It's also very important to see that a lot has been done in that field for Africa, and the African Union's work on it. That's on one side. And at the same time, if we speak about who are the audience, for me, I was a legal counsel for 5 years, and I discovered that many of the researchers and academics and even practitioners knock on my door to get some information about our treaties. So it is not easy to access it, let leave understanding the context, how it came. So it was very important to try to disseminate this information as much as possible, and make sure that having like an academic book with some background that I was able to find. It was very difficult anyways to find this background, but to bring that all together in one book for the academics and researchers to see what's happening, what for the practitioners to see what is implemented on the ground from these treaties, maybe even studying it from the side of academics will even help us in understanding the hurdles in implementation, which is very important, and you would not do that without having the documents themselves to understand the context. One good thing that also to have a wider reach out, we are in the pipeline to publish the same book in French, and hopefully later, if we are able to do it in other languages, we'll do that.
Thank you. No, it seems like this is a book that will have wide use to a broad range of users, researchers, practitioners, and academics. Now, in the introduction to your book, you wrote, "To this day, issues pertaining to the African context cannot be analyzed in isolation from the continent's colonial history." Now, what exactly did you mean by that, and how do you think that applies to the development of environmental law and policies in the region?
Well, you see, when we speak about many things, especially relating to development in Africa, we cannot see it in the abstract and away from its history. It's very important to analyze what happened before and why we came up with a certain perspective. So if we speak about the colonial history in relation to environment, we will find some traces of documents in relation to the protection of the environment. Like the Natural Resources Convention, it started regional and under colonial powers, but it was actually addressed only to managing what we have, like to manage all the resources that we have in Africa, rather than thinking of how to preserve it or how to have it used in a sustainable manner for the benefits of the future generations. And this is why I'm saying it's important to understand that, because the new natural or the revised Natural Resources Convention took all the positive aspects from what came in the first Natural Resources Convention to turn it from just a sub-regional convention to become with a wider audience with the entire continent, and moving it to the continental level, it brought in the developmental elements that are crucial for the Africans. It brought in the preservation, it brought in the idea of sustainable development. So in a nutshell, you cannot see everything that's happening today without taking it out of the context of colonialism. Unfortunately, even today, if we think about the implementation, and that's why we used to say for the colonial powers, colonialism had got to an end. But for those who were colonized, we are still analyzing and seeing the impacts of colonization on our lands. The environment is not strange to that context. And if we think about the exploitation of our natural resources until today, where our agreements and conventions come in to make sure that we have better conservation mechanisms and better preservation mechanisms because of the impacts of the extra exploitation that is still, I would consider, remittances of the colonial times. This is something like we have to think about. It's not just a narrative, but it's there and it's affecting us until today. And it's important for us to understand the history in order to understand what we have today and why we're taking some protective measures for our resources. It's because we suffered a lot from the exploitation of our resources. So it's important to bring that together, and that's why it was important as well when we speak about the development of policies in the region to think of how it evolved and how it came into being.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and when we talk about the region, we're talking about Africa, which is obviously this, incredibly large and diverse continent. But the one sort of, I guess, organizing, unifying body we have is the African Union. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the history of the African Union, starting with its inception as the Organization of African Unity and the role it has played in shaping regional environmental law on the continent.
Well, it's a very important question because you would see the difference between the African Union and the Organization of African Unity in the course of these treaties. The beginning of the Organization of African Unity was to make sure Africa is independent. That was the basic, and colonialism against Africa. So with that perspective in mind, you'll find a lot of the work of the Organization of African Unity since its inception is only focused on that aspect. But when one by one we started to get independence and the membership grew in the organization, the issue of integrity and the issue of collaboration among the Africans started to grow. And we started to see conventions coming in order to address issues cross-border between the African states in relation to environment and natural resources. But then later, which actually made the shift between the OAU and AU, when we started to think now we are better established to go further deep into the integration. That's why we moved into the African Union. So basically, we have to think about it in that perspective, because before the African Union, we have sporadic environmental treaties here and there, and we have some proposals coming from some member states. We have to protect this aspect, we have to protect that aspect. But after we got the independence, we started to have a perspective on development and integration. And that perspective is reflected definitely in our treaties, and it had a real role in shaping our regional environmental law and changing from the old dynamics and the old narrative of just protection here or there to make sure that we are complementing each other in preservation and conservation.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit about the EU treaty making process? How does the AU generally go about negotiating and entering into these agreements?
Well, the AU treaties usually, of course, they come with, at a certain point, they come with a political flow. Like if we have a heightened issue on the international agenda, which is very important to our membership, then you will find a production of a legal document. That's the beginning. But when it comes to environment, and that was basically as of the 70s onwards, you will find the course of action of the African Union was directed towards protection, preservation, good usage of environment, of our natural resources, and protection of the environment. So one of the things basically was to make sure that we have membership who understands the problem. So there is raising awareness from the side of the Commission that comes sometimes afterwards evolves into treaties. And at the same time, member states themselves, they come with proposals to propose a certain topic that they see is so crucial today because it's important nationally, and then they realize it's important regionally. Like we have many examples, like if we speak about the minerals, if we speak about the hazardous waste convention, it all came with a regional perspective beyond what we have internationally on the global sphere to make sure it addresses the issues of the region, sub-region, and the entire continent. So this is one of the things that was very important to look at, and also recognizing from one side to another, what are the missing elements for us? Why we need something here, although we have already an international convention on the issue. Why Africa needs something African? So this is also a perspective that assists in the lawmaking process in Africa. Usually the idea comes out, it depends on the political will at that point, whether it comes in soft law, in a policy or a framework, or it comes into a convention. But the ideas usually come after conferences, after a lot of studies, or from a single or a group of member states. They come and say, okay, we want this. And once it comes, if it's a mandate coming to the Commission to start drafting a convention, then a group of experts, mostly governmental experts, is formed, and they start studying the issues at hand with the assistance of the Commission and the experts in the field that they are discussing. If you speak about fisheries, you'll find experts in fisheries in the room. If you speak about general animal protection, then you'll find experts in animal issues in the room. So basically, this group of experts start bringing the ideas out, they bring the elements, then it's drafted in legal terms and put to the member states in its larger domain in order to discuss, negotiate, and we end up with the outcome of a treaty in a specific field.
Mm-hmm. And, treaties, the focus of your book are the environmental treaties of the African Union, and treaties are one method of promoting environmental cooperation. What other ways does the AU seek to promote greater regional cooperation on environmental protection? I know you mentioned soft law and policies. Are there any other methods that they can discuss?
Well, we do have mainly the implementation mechanism. So you will find in some of the conventions, some of them are just for the member states to carry out their own responsibilities. So it's not self-execution type of treaty. But then you will find in others, either a convention is followed up with some mechanisms per se, or a framework or an action plan to implement, or within the treaty itself, we have mechanisms on how to manage the implementation of the treaty. So you will have in some treaties a consultation board or an establishment of an institution in order to implement. Also within the Commission itself, as African Union, we have a department that deals with the environment, agriculture, fisheries, and blue economy that is actually mandated to assist states in implementing all the conventions that we have. At the same time, sometimes they come up proposing declarations or policy frameworks that are important to carry out a certain aspect. Also under the AU, we have different entities that implement and reach the grassroots level of implementation, like AU IBAR, for example, or PANVAC. These are some institutions that work directly on programs and projects to be implemented on the ground in Africa to assist in implementing our treaties. So in a nutshell, there are like different documents, but the more that we have the documents, the more the African Union as a commission, together with the member states, look into how best to implement it, rather than keep it just a convention or a treaty.
Mm-hmm. And when discussing treaties and implementation, you mentioned that, you know, the focus is really on some of the regional issues that may not be fully reflected in international conventions. I'm wondering, what do you believe to be the most challenging environmental issues that the African continent faces today?
Well, you see, as we speak today, Africa has the least impact on the climate change issues. We are not the ones who are like contributing. We're the least contributors rather than like the impact is. We're the least contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions, to the problems happening when it comes to climate change. Yet, we are the ones to carry the maximum impact of climate change. So if you look at this from that perspective, you'll find that we have an amazing risks in Africa that needs to be considered by the African leaders in order to protect the people. That's on one side. No one will come and knock on our door and say, okay, here, you know what, protect your forests. No. People, when they speak about forests, now they speak, okay, like we'll cut a tree, we'll have another tree. But for example, now we have desertification, we have overexploitation of our forests for production that doesn't happen in Africa. And this is another hurdle. So in that perspective, when you negotiate the convention internationally, you will have other partners who have different interests in exploiting your resources. And from your side, you need to protect your resources. So for example, apart from only one tree, I will cut a tree, I'll actually grow another. Also, from our side, we have to think of the limitation. What will be the limits that we will allow in order to make sure that we have sustainability? Because to grow a tree takes years and years. Cut it takes a second. So this is something we are the ones to take care of. That is just one example. We also have a lot of damages that are happening within our domain in relation to the conflicts, because we still have conflicts in Africa, and the weapons that are used definitely affect massively the environment in the areas that we have conflicts and using weapons there. This is something for us to consider. Again, no one will come and knock on our door to find the solution for us. One also issue which I think extremely important here, which I believe is a challenge, is the lack of control over our natural resources. So far until now, because of the old management agreements and the BITs we have with the private sector, there is an overexploitation to our natural resources. So we need to control that. We need to look and revise these things to make sure we are talking about sustainability. We do not have to continue depending on others for doing this. We have to look into how we use our treaties, our context, have more integrity among ourselves in order to create our own wealth from our natural resources to have sustainability. Here, sustainability to fund development and sustainability also to protect the environment. We have a lot of impacts, especially if we speak about the climate change impacts, the challenge of the forced migration and displacement, food insecurity, water insecurity. We have areas now faced with floods that had never had floods. We have areas now facing droughts that was always rich in water. We have also, because of all of the problems in rural areas, we end up with rural movement or rural-urban movement. That's why we end up with slums around all our big cities. People are living in a very unhealthy environment. And if we do not plan for this and connect migration to climate change, then we would not realize why people are moving. When you ask the people, and this is one challenge, is raising the awareness of climate change itself and environmental protection, because you will find a lot of people, if you ask them, have you moved because of the impacts of climate change? No, 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 no. This is for the politicians in the government. It's like it doesn't affect us. Then you ask them, so then why did you move? It's like, oh, all of a sudden my land has been salinated because of the sea, and I cannot grow my plants. Or all of a sudden I don't have a sustainable source of water, so I like my land is not arable anymore. So they don't realize that this is climate change. And this is something also a challenge that we have to think about and think of how to plan it in order to also assist these communities to live well, protect our environment, and at the same time, make sure we do adaptation to our environment, adaptation to the fisheries communities that move inland because they cannot find fish anymore at sea, or because the sea ate the land they live in and they cannot move. This is also another thing that we have to think about when we speak about the rural movement in Africa. We're ethnic communities. Moving from an ethnicity to a land of another ethnicity might cause security problems. So this is something for us to forecast. No one will do that for us. And that's why you think about the African continent, the African challenge. This is our challenges. We have, of course, a lot of cross-border movement sometimes to hazardous waste, or to for example, if a state accepts to dump within its land a nuclear material and it is a landlocked state, then in order to reach that land, the material will move into 5-6 countries from sea up to that land. This needs protection. It's us to do it. This is another challenge for us and for our people. At the end of the day, I think the unsustainable use of our natural resources affects our environment a lot. And the unsustainability doesn't come from the Africans. It comes from the bad agreements that are signed with other partners or the private sector that overexploit our natural resources, from land, sea, game reserves. If you think about even the simple thing, the game reserves, when we hear until now that we have poaching that's happening, it's not the Africans that are poaching, it's someone else coming from outside of Africa is doing the poaching to an endangered species. When we have an endangered species in decline or it disappears, it affects the ecosystem of the environment in Africa, because then you will find if it's that endangered species from the predators, then it affects the number that will grow from those that were used to be eaten by the predator. So this is also something that we have to think about, because it affects us in our future, and for our future generation. We're a young continent, and we have to bear all of these challenges in mind and take them into consideration in implementing our treaty.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and a lot of these challenges you discussed are transnational in nature. And when you talk about forced migration due to climate change, or food insecurity or water insecurity, and this, of course, would likely involves a lot of cooperation across states that answer different constituencies and might have different views about how to go about this. I wonder, what do you think are the greatest challenges to regional cooperation, and how does the African Union work to sort of overcome these challenges?
Well, I would start with the political will of states themselves, and at the same time, the internal conflicts we have, because sometimes in some states, because of the internal conflicts, you will find the government that is recognized and we cooperate with doesn't have a control over the entire state. So if you have programs to implement, you will implement it on a small piece of land, and the others are not part of the other parts of the land are not part of the programs. And that is definitely a problem in the implementation. And I would say we need more to promote peace and security in order to do more in integration. The other thing is the issue of how we can really deal with the continent in its entirety. Because until now, you will find some impacts and remittances of colonialism, of splitting parts of Africa. When you speak in some parts of the world about Africa, they speak about sub-Saharan Africa, and then they say, okay, and North Africa is connected to the Middle East, but it's still called North Africa, so it's Africa. So when we look at these issues, we have to look at Africa as Africa, and that is something that we need to change our own narrative, because at the end of the day, as you just mentioned, if you speak about forced migration, and it comes also because of climate change, and one of the regions now that faces terrorism, faces conflicts, as well as climate change, is the Sahel region. And the Sahel region is the one that is bordering North Africa. The problems coming even with the irregular migration to the north comes mostly from that region, from these countries. So if you do not connect and change the narrative of the challenges facing those people together with the other part of Africa, then we are missing something, and that is a challenge. And we cannot get African solutions for African problems unless we change our own narrative and think in that way. This is, I believe, extremely important. At the same time, we have to consider the issue of hard law versus soft law. Sometimes our challenge is to make sure to bring conventions. Sometimes it's difficult because by the time they ratify, they might be obsolete, or the text itself needs amendments because things changed. So we have to think about this in a different way. We have to also complement each other, and that is, again, in relation to changing the narrative. If we have African states, like Africa has 25 LLDC, it has LDCs, and it has middle income countries. It doesn't have any high income country. But I argue within an LLDC up to the middle income countries, we have enough brains to move among ourselves, which is what we call South cooperation. And that will assist us in bringing more sustainable development to each other, more understanding the context more. Definitely, I'm bringing someone from another continent to come to the African continent to assist in agriculture, might not understand the context of why people cannot get the grains from those people and not that people. But if you bring an African from anywhere in the continent, he or she will understand that context. So it's important for us, and I think this is why I'm saying changing the narrative and using our own expertise in-house. And maybe this is something like, I would say, food for thought for the future, to have list of experts from every country on all of these, and we start to exchange. We will compensate them properly, but definitely they will still cost us much cheaper than someone coming outside of the continent. And at the same time, we'll benefit from each other. It's a full cycle. It's exactly like when we speak about using funds from the diaspora in development. It's the same thing. Instead of having the money going just to the families, if we had the techniques to teach the families to use this money in small and medium enterprises, they will generate income themselves and will have more sustainability than waiting every month for some money coming from the diaspora. So this is something that we have to ourselves think about, how to cooperate more in, how to make sure that all of these will fall into the sustainable development of the continent. And also, it will affect the environment, because at the end of the day, if I'm bringing someone who's an expert in fisheries to address issues in relation to fisheries, they will teach the fishing communities what to do and what not to do. And this is not going to be done without our real integration, our full communication, and communicating our own documents to the grassroots level. I'll give you just a simple example to sum up this point. I remember, because when I was in the UN, we used to negotiate the law of the sea and the fisheries resolutions every year, which is like the longest resolutions in the General Assembly. They are really very long and very technical. And you spend hours and hours, like you can come in the meeting room 9 a.m., leave the other day, like the following day, 9 a.m., negotiating just a text, which is still soft law. But I felt the value of this when I went on a fishing trip in George Lake in upstate New York. When the guy on the boat told us to throw back the fish because the conservation management told them if the fish doesn't reach a certain like a measurement, has to be thrown back because it's still a baby. So we have to throw it back. This is what we need in Africa. And we need to make sure that these elements reach our communities in pastoral lands, in fisheries, everywhere, in order to make sure that they know how to sustain the environment. And if one of our countries managed well, why wouldn't we use its expertise in that field? I think that will be way more useful than just having the conventions and saying, oh, we need to have more regional integration. No, this is exactly where we have regional integration and cooperation.
Oh, absolutely. And that sharing of expertise across the region, particularly between middle income and LDC countries, is such an important piece of it. So thank you for speaking to that. Now I want to transition a little to ask you about some of the other instruments in your book. So you also include in the volume a discussion of certain human rights instruments, like the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, for example, which at least on their face would not appear to a layperson to be environmental treaties. Can you explain a little why you included these human rights treaties in this volume and how they function to promote and solidify environmental legal norms in the region?
Well, the book did not tackle only the environmental treaties per se. It also brought the articles and provisions in the sectoral conventions that are not related to environment that brings the element of protection of environment and sustainable development. This is because it complements each other. And when we speak about changing the narrative, you will see that in the last decade or two, it became part and parcel of every convention that we adopt, the issue of protection of environment and sustainable development. So that is a change in the way the African Union member states think about the protection of environment and sustainable development. So that's the starting point. When it comes to the charter itself and the like both charters and the issue of the court, the issue of the committee, and why did I bring them? Simply, when I was doing the research, what I discovered that we have a very important element that we codified in these charters that has never been codified before. It came in declarations globally, but it has never arrived to become an aspect in hard law, which is the right to a healthy environment. It only came in hard law by the African Union. So it was considered as a production of the African Union. And that came within the African Charter. The other issue here, like, it's nice to have, okay, it's right. How we protect that right? What do you mean with having the right to healthy environment? In the book, you will find that the very few cases that actually wrote the environmental treaties of the African Union into action on the African level was one, the Ogai community, and the other one is the Ogono community in Nigeria and Kenya. These cases were brought up by representatives of these communities because of actions either by the government or the private sector that affected the environment of these communities. Some of them forced them to move because of the pollution. For Africans, land is life. So when you come and say, okay, you will have to move from here and go somewhere else, it's like where? And they will have to establish themselves in a land they're not attached to. It's very difficult. So in those cases, you will realize that the committee had actually given meaning and an interpretation to the right to healthy environment. That's on one side. On the other, we have also in these implementation mechanisms the context when it came to Nigeria, when the committee held not only the government but the private sector responsible for the actions. This was also not like recognized before, because at the end of the day, the actions that were happening in Nigeria did not happen directly because neither the army or the government of Nigeria, but it came because of a concession given to a company from the private sector to do exploitation in the region of the community. So simply, all these implications were not only affecting the community, but it's affecting the entire region. So the committee, although it addresses the Nigerian government, it still held the company working responsible and said they were working supported by the military actions. Hence, those people have a case and it was accepted. So that is why, if you think about it, that although the charter is not, as you said, face value is an environmental treaty, but in reality, it used the environmental treaties to the benefit of the rights. And the right to healthy environment is mentioned in the charter, is not mentioned in the other treaties. But of course, it was all reconnected when the case came about. And that is why it was very important to articulate that from an African Union perspective, that we have environment as such for human beings as important as the right to life.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. And, you know, arguably one of the most, in addition to these human rights agreements, arguably one of the most significant regional agreements to be concluded in Africa in recent years is the agreement establishing the Continental Free Trade Area, which you discuss in chapter 26 of your book. And I understand that you also had a hand in drafting. You know, this is the largest free trade area since the formation of the WTO. And I wonder, how do you see this agreement influencing environmental legal norms on the continent moving forward?
Well, this is exactly like your previous question when we say it's at face value, it has nothing to do with the environment. But because we're speaking about trade. So everybody will say, okay, we're talking about trade, investments, why are you speaking about environment here? But if you think about it and how it's connected, we have, as I said, it became like part and parcel of the conventions. We have a provision saying protection of environment and sustainable development. So now, if you speak about the CFTA with all its protocols, because it includes investment, includes trade, it even has a protocol for freedom of movement of goods and human beings. So if you think about this in its totality or the entirety of the documents coming under the CFTA, you will realize that protection of environment is crucial, because if we speak about trade, trade includes all the materials and goods we have, whether produced or raw material. We are very good land for raw material. So if I am speaking about, again, let me go back to the example of the wood. If we go about the forests and we are trading in the wood, if we do not realize that we are not considering the limitations that we are going to cut trees this year in, which means the limit that we will be able to trade in, then we will have unsustainability to our forests. So here we are connecting it to the environment. That's on like just a simple example. If we go further down to the protocol of investment, and we are talking about different investments coming from around the globe, to look, to exploit, to excavate, to do everything with our natural resources. Here, if we are not thinking of bringing the element of protection of environment, then we are talking about allowing everybody to do what they want and impact the others, which is going to be crucial. Here, if I'm speaking about the exploitation of the natural resources, and if it is overexploited, it is not sustainable. If I'm allowing investments in certain fields and it will impact the environment without taking into consideration the impacts of the environment, the communities, like what happened with the Ogoni and the Gai community, they can go file cases against the governments themselves, not only against like the investors, but against the government that allowed the investors to do damage to their environment. So here, it's all interconnected, and that is why environment and even like our cooperation, when we do it like in clusters, if we don't see it at a certain point in its totality, then we keep missing elements. So here it's crucial to see how important the CFTA to the environment, how important trade will be important to make sure that we are able also to bring elements to protect our environment. While at the same time, investment has to be done in a sustainable manner, protecting the environment and not damaging the environment. And if there is a damage, it has to be minimized. One of the examples that I'm still studying it because I don't know where it is, like, and it's now, I would say it's fashionable. If we speak about the batteries for electric cars and electric machinery, that we will say, okay, we're only going to use batteries in place of fossil fuels. Everybody speaks about this is a great investment because it will minimize the greenhouse gas emissions. The problem coming now in the global north saying, okay, how we will dispose these batteries? But no one until now came up with a real solid study to tell us or to compare between the emissions that is actually happening from the moment you start exploiting a natural resource up to the production of this battery versus the use of fossil fuels. Which one brings more greenhouse gas emissions? This is something we need to look into as Africans, because we are the ones who suffer from the pollution, from taking the tin, the tungsten, the cobalt, to like all of these things are happening, the lithium for these batteries. All our mobiles, all of these batteries have a part of Africa, either the DRC Congo or Namibia or somewhere from Africa in our hands. Does anyone consider the amount of pollution and damage to the environment that happens in Africa because of the exploitation of these mineral resources in unsustainable manner? This is something we need as Africans to look into. This is something we need to raise. We need to bring it to the attention of our leaders to make sure that this will have a major impact on us and on our sustainability. This is definitely part and parcel of the CFTA, because it's part and parcel of the investment and it's part and parcel of trade. So this is something we have also to keep considering. And that's why I'm saying it has to be seen in its totality. And for us, if we think about, again, back to our slogan, African solutions for African problems, we will be the only ones raising this. No one will raise it because it's not to their benefit. Why? It's happening far away from me. I only receive the battery. All what happened before the battery, I don't care about because it didn't happen in my land. Then I, as a state, actually assisted in bringing down the greenhouse emissions. But that is not true. And this is something we need to look into as Africans.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. No, I think that oftentimes in the discourse, this need to encourage investment and trade in the region can be seen as at odds with also the need to strengthen environmental regulation and protection. So it's great to hear that the ACFTA can provide a framework for dealing with some of these issues. So I do want to save a few minutes for Q&A, but I do have just one last question for you. And so I'd just like to go back to the theme of the ASIL annual conference this year, which was International Law in an Interdependent World. And for that, I'd like to ask, what can the African Union model for environmental legal norm building teach other regions in regional blocks about how to approach cooperation on environmental law issues?
Well, I would say for other regions, it's important to exchange the knowledge on how to do better integration, lessons learned of our mistakes and other mistakes to make it better. One example comes to mind, because now it's the model in integration, is the European Union. So how we can take that as an example to make our integration better. How we can ultimately reach the level of integration, economic integration, and development to allow properly freedom of movement of people. This is what happened in the EU. We can study that and see how we can go step by step to make sure we reach that level. These are like things that it's important for us to understand. If we have, for example, we have forests, we have a lot of different types of forests, exactly like Latin America or like parts of Asia. We should exchange lessons learned with them. We should understand how they came about to protect the forests or to protect a certain species. And then we can see how we can adjust that, adapt it to our own context and implement it. That will definitely affect the protection of the environment. If we think about predators, we're not the only ones who have predators. We, like Asia, has tigers. So how they are protecting the different species of tigers, how they are managing it when in a populous country like India. So these things we can learn from and also copy it for the protection of the environment in Africa. How we can make sure that we can reach a level of integration properly through not only by laws, but by implementation, like the integration of the European Union. The European Union started with the European Community. It took them 60 years to reach the European Union. I think it's about time for us to take step by step in order to study this and to make sure that apart from the political issues that we have, even until today, the European Union are not 100% in harmony politically, but economically, they have policies for development, for sustainable development, for protection of environment. This is something we have to look into and see how we can do it together, because in reality, Africa faces the same challenge when it comes, for example, back to the issue of the fisheries. In the meetings of negotiations of the fisheries in the UN, the European Union speak on behalf of its membership. Maybe it's time that we think of the sectors that is within the environment that we can address within our constituency first, and when we go into the global arena, we speak in one voice. I come from a multilateral background. The power of the numbers speak volumes. And that is why I do believe that we need to do that. And we need to take step by step in every sector when it comes to the environment to see how we can speak in one voice when it comes to the protection of the environment and sustainable development in Africa.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for this very enlightening discussion. Now, I just want to very quickly turn it over to my colleague, Kareem, who will now just lead our Q&A portion for the next few minutes.
Thank you, Bitai and Ambassador Negm. That was indeed an excellent conversation. We did receive 2 questions from Eva Keita. The first one is, how can a state particularly implement AU treaties and recommendations in the environmental field while also fulfilling its international obligation under other agreements like investment treaties or contracts? The second one is, does the AU play a role in helping states reconcile their environmental duties with prior commitments made to promote investment, either regionally or internationally? And finally, I have a kind of a sum-up question for you, Ambassador, regarding the whole discussion. Don't you think that states see an opposition between trade and development, and also regulations or regulating environment in their territories, because it seems that people see an opposition between the two of them. You mentioned the African Free Trade Agreement as part of playing a role to combine the two of them, but I just wanted to hear more on this topic as well. Thank you.
Okay, Karim, thank you very much, but I will need you to remind me with the questions one by one.
So let's start with the first one. It's about us. So how can a state practically implement AU treaties and recommendations in the environmental field while also fulfilling its international obligation under other agreements like investment treaties or contracts?
Okay, well, first of all, the states themselves, when they negotiate the treaties in the African Union, they make sure it does not contradict the international treaties. So that is number one. So the umbrella is there, the international agreed language for any treaty, and then we have the regional one. So it's not difficult to reconcile them because mostly the regional ones are bringing elements from the international one into the regional context and adding some elements to it. So it is not very difficult to harmonize these two internally. So for the states to carry out its obligations, this is not a big deal. Some of the things that are like some of the provisions in our treaties are addressing our context, and it goes a step further than the international treaty. But exactly like the right to health environment that comes in our own treaties, it doesn't come into the international treaties. But it does not contradict the international treaty. So this is easy to harmonize.
Regarding the second question, it's about the AU's role in helping states reconciling their environmental duties with prior commitments made to investment, either regionally or internationally.
Well, the African Union has a lot of programs to implement our treaties. When we speak about the CFTA, that is actually part and parcel of their work, because one of the things that came in the treaty, that whatever comes in the treaty should not affect the obligations that were taken or adopted by the states prior to the adoption of the treaty. But let us assume that one state has a problem with a BIT that has been signed before, that is contradictory to the CFTA, and it is willing to adapt it to the CFTA. Hence, it can knock on the door of the Secretariat to ask them, can you please assist in this and that? This is one means to assist. But the generic thing, like approach, was what happened before. It's up to the states to do what they want and how to adapt it. Because at the end of the day, it's left to the power of the states, because some of these BITs are, or most of them, are connected to countries outside of the continent, which means outside of the scope of implementation of the CFTA, because the CFTA obligates Africans towards Africans. But of course, because Africans towards Africans affect Africans towards others, part and parcel of the work of the CFTA Secretariat, together with the Department of Trade in the African Union, is to try to disseminate the information of the CFTA, raise the awareness, see what can be done to make sure that things are harmonized from the day states ratified and the treaty entered into force onwards, to make sure there are no contradictions. But again, they are like not connected unless the state itself connect them together.
Mm-hmm. And final question then, in a very short answer for you. I was asking about the opposition between trade development and also regulating environment. Don't you think that this is the hardest challenge for states to implement rules and regulations and laws to protect their environment while they're also seeking development and trade cooperation with other states?
I agree with you 100%, and that's why I keep saying we ourselves need to change the narrative. Why I'm saying this? Because I would claim personally that if we have more control over our own natural resources, we will be able to have a sustainable source of income for our development. And here I give the example of Niger. Niger has, after the last change of government, decided to change the price of like trading in one strategic resource. I'm not speaking about all the minerals they have. I'm not speaking about anything. It's only one aspect. They decided to change the price of uranium they are selling to France. One of the things that came out of this last coup or change in Niger, that it showed that the uranium was sold to France with a fraction of a euro. It's a fraction of a euro, while its price in the market was 200 euros. So adjusting the price of within trade between the fraction of the euro to the 200 euros, we have research now saying Niger, which is an LLDC, will be one of the fast growing to become maybe a middle income country, not even an LDC. So this is something that we have to think about. If we only connect the trade here, if I think about it in the context of environment, if I am thinking of the reason why is exactly the paradox you mentioned, Karim. The reason why some states might be lenient on environmental protection is because they need the money for investments that come through the FDIs in order to invest in a project for development. Yet this is not sustainable. The sustainability will come when I am able to generate my own income a bit by bit. And this is the way we can generate our own income, to put our hands on our own natural resources, to make sure that we renegotiate the BITs, we renegotiate the investment protocols that are signed, and they are actually against our interests on the long term, not on the short term. This is for us to decide, and it depends on the political will of states to do that or not.
Thank you, Ambassador Negm, and thank you, Mbidza Maweni, for joining us today as part of ASOL Global Engagement Series events. We are now concluding this discussion. Excellent topic again on environmental protection on the African continent. For the audience and for everyone, you can find the book on the Bruil website. We'll make sure also to share the link on the social media platforms. Thank you for listening, and we'll make sure to discuss a new topic next year. Thanks.